Hey, Fabio here of My Own Defender. Here are the 3 common problems that people have in pistol training. All right, here's problem number 1 that we see when people are training pistol. You're connected to your sights instead of being connected to the target. You're staring at your sights because somebody beat you over the head with front sight focus. We've all been there and done that. As we get into like the dot systems and all that stuff, or we into the more advanced like pistol shooters, even on the iron system, we learned that staying connected to the target is the ticket for the best accuracy and speed combined. And so disconnecting from your sights can be a thing that you need to work on. One of the things that you can try to be connected to the target and get away from staring at your sighting system is to put a visual reference on the target, even some kind of color. You can paint it in with a Sharpie, or you can put a paster up there. That doesn't mean that that's your bullseye. Sometimes I put that up in classes and people try to shoot just that, slow everything down because they're trying to like hit just a 1-inch square. That's not what that is. It's a visual reference. It helps you connect to the target. It sucks you into the target and away from your sighting system so that you have something on the target you can stare at that will help you bring the gun to that spot over and over again. In fact, if you use it for too long, then it can be counterproductive, right? If you use it for years and years and you always have a spot on the target. Eventually, if you use it enough times, you can learn to then put your own spot on each target, right? With your eyes, you put a spot on the target that doesn't have one, and then bring the gun to that spot. The better you can get at this, working at this, the more of those problems are going to go away. Some of the ways that we see the people like on the line, for example, at a range, that they're connected to the sights versus the target. Like if you're doing this, like I have an empty gun here. Am I in the frame here? Yes? So I want to make sure. So like, a lot of people, when they're shooting properly, they're like heads up, like the gun comes up to their eye line, they're looking at the target and they shoot blah, 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 blah. And then sometimes you'll see this guy, right? Like the gun comes up and they start doing this with their head. They start craning forward with their head because they're like only looking through the tube, we call it, through the red dot, or even iron sights, right? They lower their head and they crane forward because they're staring at their sights. So even that motion, that posture of craning forward can be an indication that you're staring at your sights very, very hard. And so if you're seeing yourself doing that on video, it's evidence that you're doing that, and you might want to check this out as, you know, a kind of exercise that you can do to get out of it. Other things that you might do is like if you're looking at a spot on the target and then you move the gun off the target, if your eyes disconnect from the target for a quick second and then snap back, for example. So if I'm looking at a rock over there, I got my sights on the rock right there. If I move the gun and my eyes stay perfectly connected to the rock and I don't have any kind of like focal change, I know that I'm staring at the spot, the target, whatever. But if for a split second my eyes do like a little glitch because they're trying to follow the color of the sights or whatever, then you know you may have a problem staring at your sights. So something else that you can try. Those 2 things can be some helpful ways to disconnect from your sights and stay connected to the target, because it's very, very important that you learn how to do that. Okay, problem number 2 that we see people having in training, especially when they're doing, you know, specifically to the pistol. Inconsistent grip, an application of grip that doesn't make sense. The gun doesn't behave in a way that is productive, conducive to good shooting. How do we make the gun behave a certain way? You're going to have to put a structure around your pistol grip and certain pressures around your pistol grip so that the gun can behave similarly or ideally like the same over and over again. We call that the predictability of the gun behavior, right? The gun will behave over and over again the same way if the structure around the grip is the same and the pressures don't change through a stringer fire, on the draw, on the reload, so on and so forth. So things to look for in your training. People will often associate flat guns, here the big air quotes, flat guns, guns that shoot and look like they're flat, as like an indication of success. That on its own actually is not success. A good grip will maintain the gun from rising a whole bunch, but the most important part that you can and should work on is that the gun returns the same way to the same spot over and over again. Flat guns, you know, flat earthers sometimes get really connected to flat guns. I don't encourage you focusing on that, because a lot of times it'll encourage you to drive the gun, have a lot of tension in different places that is not necessary. You start pushing into the gun so that the gun doesn't rise at all. It's truly counterproductive. Now, it may look cool on Instagram or YouTube or whatever, but then when you start looking at the targets, you have start seeing these trends of mystery, like, oh, how come I got that really low delta or low Charlie? Like, because you're pushing into the gun, trying to prevent the gun from rising, and that's just counterproductive. So the things that you want to be focused on is, how do I put structure around the pistol and what kind of pressures do I put around the pistol so that the gun can raise and come back in a very predictable manner, right? We don't want the gun to rise crazy. We also don't want to drive the gun forward. The balance is going to be found in your training, in your shooting. So things that we see, what we try to avoid is the gun from like separating from your hand. Like let's say the gun is like really well in my support hand. I don't know, can you see that really well there? If the gun starts separating in recoil where you have a gap now between your fingers and the trigger guard, when you start having a gap between your, like in the shooting sequence, you start seeing this. So if you watch video of yourself, especially in slow motion, that can be really informative as to whether you have the right amount of pressures around the gun so that the gun is moving as one unit. Essentially between the wrist and the front of the muzzle of the gun, you want that thing to be moving in one unit. You don't want any wrist break like that. And you definitely don't want a separation of your hand with the trigger guard, right? So that pressure in itself will sort itself out if you're paying attention to that. Do my hands allow the gun to swivel inside my grip? If that's happening, the pressure is not enough. The other way that people screw this up, problems, is that they try to maintain that gun behavior with their dominant side. So they'll crush the gun with their strong side, and then that starts creating all sorts of trigger problems because the tension in your dominant side will then start pressing the gun in a way where the gun moves every time you press the trigger. So you press the trigger and you get that little dip. That's not necessarily jerking the trigger, it's a grip problem because you're adding tension, undue tension, while you're trying to manipulate the trigger nicely. So be focused on more of a support side pressure, not that the dominant side doesn't have any pressure, but be focused on the support side pressure and look for any kind of separation or swivel of the gun inside your hands. As far as like the structure of the gun, or structure of the grip around the gun, I think that's very individual. There's not a one size fits all because the grips of the pistols are different sizes for a lot of different manufacturers. The size of your fingers, the size of your palms, the strength of your hands. For me to say, hey, you have to have this very specific thing in the back, this very specific thing in the front, is not going to be good for everybody. Some people that have very short fingers, sometimes they have to rotate their hand more forward just so they can manipulate the trigger, right? So that's going to be very individual. What you want to try to maintain is as much surface of the grip covered with your hands. That tends to be good for a lot of people. You want to be as high as you can on the back strap of the gun. That seems to be very good for a lot of people. But other than that, be more focused on how the gun is behaving while you're shooting. If you focus on how the gun behaves while you're shooting, it will inform you as to you needing to change something or reinforce something. If the gun is behaving really great, awesome, keep doing that. How do I make the gun behave like this over and over again? I'm getting good results, the time is good, the accuracy is good, great. That's you being an active participant in your learning. A lot of people don't like to do that. They just want a golden pill or something, or a golden ticket, so that they can be like, I have this grip that somebody gave me and now it's perfect. No. You're gonna have to check this out and you're gonna have to do some live fire to test it. Watch for separation, that's the pressure issue. Watch for like where you like hold the gun, the index points of your gun, like where your contact points are on the gun. If you have good contact points and they're consistent, every time you grab the gun, every time you reload the gun is in the same place. That's the structure. And the pressures don't change. Whether it's the first shot or through a string of fire, the more you're consistent, results will appear on paper and on the clock, on the timer. I hope that's helpful. Okay, and this is problem number 3 that we see pistol shooters having when they train. Depending on what school of thought you come from, sometimes accuracy is final. That's the kind of person you come from, or that kind of pedagogy you come from. The other person might be like, oh, speed is super important, and so I have to do things this way. I think there needs to be a balance for sure. And so what I would want you to avoid is, when I go to the range, I shoot, and if I don't get the accuracy I want, I do everything like super carefully. I get a slow press, I get a surprise break, and all. You start thinking about all these things that are not productive and don't help you actually get better at the shooting pieces, right? So a lot of the times I'll go to the range and I'm watching people like on the line like this, and they're like, they draw, they take a breath, they have like 97 fundamentals to shooting, whatever, they take a breath, and then they'll touch the trigger like, no, I'm not ready, and they'll milk the gun, whatever, all this like super slow stuff. And then here's the stuff that specifically to this video is that they'll touch the trigger and they'll methodically, slowly, carefully take the slack. This trigger doesn't have any, but I'm pressing, and then eventually you get what some instructors would tell you to do is like the surprise break. Now, what the surprise break encourages is not moving the sights, not moving the gun when the shot breaks. But it's unrealistic because when it matters, when shooting matters, you're going to have some time component, not just an accuracy component. whether it's a self-defense scenario, competition scenario, whatever. Some time component is going to be associated with your accuracy component. So it is counterproductive to have these slow trigger presses as your training methodology. Now, should you be able to hit something very small if you have all the time in the world? Yes, you should be able to have very, very good accuracy, and trigger press will help you get that very good accuracy. But that may be 2 or 3% of your rounds, period. Like that, your training should be very, very small in this kind of slow methodical. And then the rest of the time, you need to be exploring other ways of manipulating the trigger. All right, so the way I teach it, the way I talk about trigger manipulation is you should be able to touch the trigger from all sorts of different locations. From outside, from air gap, right? Having an air gap between the trigger and your finger, from touching the trigger without taking any slack out, and from prep, which for me is a short prep, thanks to the awesome trigger. But for some of you guys on a Glock or something, you may have a very long prep to what we consider the last wall before the trigger actually breaks, right? So learning to manipulate the trigger from all these 4 different locations can inform you as to whether your grip is supporting what you want to do, whether your eyes can stay connected to the target and all that stuff. And when you manipulate your trigger from different distances, right? The more the travel, the more likelihood you are to move the gun, right? If I have more travel, I stupid can jump in there and mess it up. Less travel, less opportunity for stupid to jump in there and mess it up, right? If you're looking at all these different travel locations, you're going to start learning your tendencies. Man, when I slam the trigger from like all the way outside the trigger guard, something like this, am I in there? If I slam from all the way in here, I am likely to like push left or push right or whatever, like I push down or whatever. Or when I'm inside the trigger guard, it's this. When I'm touching the trigger, is that. You should learn your tendencies so that you can mitigate the movement of the gun when the gun actually breaks, when the trigger actually breaks. Nothing else matters. The violence of your trigger finger, the travel of your trigger finger, until the trigger breaks, none of that is significant. Who cares what's happening before the trigger breaks? So at trigger break, how do I keep the gun from moving? That's the important part. So don't get stuck. The problem that I'm trying to avoid for people. Don't get stuck on only manipulating your trigger from that really slow trigger press, trapping the trigger, or trigger reset, all that trash that's been going on for years. Rather, in training, even in dry fire, right? You know, so if I'm looking at a small spot on a target, I'm in dry fire, I might go from outside the waistband to like smashing and see how much movement of my sights around that spot I get. Maybe I'll go from air gap, right? And like hold the gun the way I want to, nice tight grip, look to a spot, and I'll smash all the way through. What I'm going to learn that from each location that I start from, I may get X amount of movement, and some of it might be okay. If I'm at 5 yards, it almost doesn't matter how much the gun is moving, but if I'm at 15 or 20 yards, it's gonna matter a whole bunch. You should know how to manipulate your trigger and support that trigger press with your grip and with your attention, with your eyes on the target. I hope you find that helpful, and we'll see you next time.